But conflict is one of those things where when you bring it up, a lot of people try to avoid it, right? A lot of people are not too keen on jumping into conflict. But I'll make the argument that, oftentimes people say, well, I don't like conflict. And I just don't think that that's true because most of the stuff that you see in the media, most of the stuff that you see in the television shows, most of the things that you see on social media, people flock to conflict. I think that a lot of time they're just not comfortable dealing with the emotional impact or the responsibility that it takes in order for them to go in and do the work of resolving it. Um, so one of the definitions that I often use is one of my favorite definitions that conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving those goals. And I highlight perceive because when you are in an institution of higher education, whether it's working with the student or whether it's working with the organization itself, a lot of times we perceive that there's a conflict that's present, but 9 times out of 10, or in a lot of cases, if you have some intentional conversations about what it is that we're dealing with, you may realize that the conflict isn't what you thought it would be. I always use a fruit here, an orange. And this is very simple, very basic explanation. I know conflict is a lot more detailed than this, but if I walked into a room and I had this orange and I was about to throw it away and Macy said, "No, let me have that orange." But then if Brittany said, "No, I would like to have that orange." On the outside looking in, it could be perceived that this could be a potential conflict. But in the conversation, if you realize that Macy wants to cook with the peels of the orange, while Brittany may not have eaten all day, and she needs the food the fruit to eat, you realize that there's not a conflict there at all. We see this manifest with our students. We see this manifest with our leadership. We see this manifest across the board. Where if you have people that are comfortable enough in having hard conversations, we can alleviate a lot of stuff on the front end. Whatever, without ever having to dive too deep into it. It's only when you avoid it that it continues to compound and grow even more. Um, some of the attitudes about conflict that we usually see is we usually is all is conflict is usually regarded in negative terms. It's one of the most pervasive aspects of human affairs. It exists in almost all relationships, whether it's personal, whether it's organizational, whether it's formal, informal. A lot of times we view it as something to be avoided or feared. Um, when it's uncontained, it can erupt in an argument, destruction, violence, and war. And a lot of times, the psychological damages include loss of productivity on the job, destruction of relationships, and organizational breakdown. I think that a lot of times when we're dealing with individuals and we're talking about conflict, for those individuals who aren't comfortable navigating these spaces, they assume that if I just avoid this situation, then it'll go away. But a lot of times that's not the reality. And I try to, in my conversations, I try to reframe how we think about conflict because it's so much more than how we see it. The reality is that conflict it motivates people to act and break away from complacency. A lot of times when conflict occurs, it occurs because what we're doing is not working anymore, and it's time to evaluate and figure out how do we move forward. Sometimes necessary to bring an awakening to the dysfunctional relationship or behavior. It can be a source of growth in organizations, communities, societies. It can lead to positive change and new relationships. And it also helps people join together and clarify goals. And so when I try to interact with individuals through a lens of conflict, I try to help them understand that it wouldn't be a conflict if what we were doing was working. And so how do we reframe that notion of this being negative and turning it into something that's positive? And one of my favorite quotes that I see from Kenneth Clough, he indicates that conflict is an indicator of a need to make a transition to a new state and an opportunity to develop new skills and evolve to that new state. If we always stay the same or we always stay complacent, the likelihood of the organization or our relationships growing is limited. And we know that because if you think about it, most of the individuals in your life that you're closest with are those individuals that you've gone through conflict with because you've had that time in which you all have had hard conversations, or that person has held you accountable. Or I think about mentorship. I don't want a mentor that's not going to hold me accountable or have those hard conversations with me. And so it's the indicator that we're transitioning to a new state and transitioning to a